Hi, my name's Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about yin and yang. Alright, so normally in my videos I talk a lot about non-duality and how essentially reality is non-dual, meaning not two. And basically everything is all one thing, and that one thing is connected, and that one thing is infinite and perfect and unconditionally loving. But for this video, I'm going to step into the perspective of duality and the illusion of duality to specifically explore the two subtle energies of yin and yang. Now, ultimately, with regard to these two subtle energies, there's not a separation between the two. Ultimately, they're always together. They're never separate. So there is the image of the god Shiva and the goddess Shakti, who are depicted in the Abhyam position, like always in intercourse with one another. And that is sort of how that works in reality. There's always a connection between yin and yang. And another metaphor that I think is quite helpful is to think about the ocean. So basically you have the vast ocean, and the ocean itself would be a representation of yin. And I'll get into the qualities of yin and yang in just a minute. So the ocean would be yin. But the waves in the ocean, the thing that gives the ocean movement, would be yang. But there's never any wave that's separate from the ocean. They're always just one thing. So that's the way that yin and yang work in reality. They can't really be separate because, again, reality is non-dual. But from the perspective of the illusion of duality, these energies can be detected, and they have certain qualities about them that can be noticed. Before I get into the particular qualities of each, is that these are two polar energies, and it is the ebb and flow between these two energies that essentially create all living and non-living systems. As such, yin and yang are basically the binary code that creates everything in reality. And that's true from something as small as an atom to as big as the cosmos, from the individual human psyche to an entire society. And it is yin and yang in intercourse with one another, completely integrated, that give life to these phenomena. And if you look around at reality, it is chock full of symbolism that reflects yin and yang. And basically, it is probably one of the main things that you could apply the insight as above, so below to, because you can just see reflections of it everywhere. So in keeping with the idea of as above, so below, I'm going to be sharing with you some reflections of yin and yang in our world that really illustrate the difference and distinction between those two polar energies. Alright, so because yin and yang are essentially energies, and they're subtle energies at that, they're very difficult to pick up on. The only times that I ever really had a really clear experience of yin and yang, and specifically yin, was when I had transcended the ego. Currently, just from memory, I can kind of pick up on this and that. I can kind of pick up on, like, generally which way a thing might lean. I get kind of an intuitive sense for that. But it's nowhere near as strong as what it was when I transcended the ego. So in order to pick up on these subtle polar energies, like, you would probably have to sort of cultivate sensitivity to that. But basically, when yin and yang, they are expressionless, that's what I'm talking about, but there's often many common expressions of yin and yang, and it can be very helpful for understanding because they often express themselves in a way that is very dualistic. And so there are a good number of, and probably thousands of dichotomies that you can look at that are clear reflections of yin and yang. But there are a few that I really want to focus on because I think those illustrate the nature of yin and yang best. Alright, so there are 5 major yin and yang dichotomies that I'm going to explore in this video. But before that, I want to mention that one of the dichotomies will be masculine and feminine. And so you'll notice as I describe these dichotomies that they're often able to be symbolized in human form as man and woman, or as a goddess figure or a god figure. And so you'll notice kind of a feminine symbolism relative to yin, and you'll notice a masculine symbolism relative to yang. And so I wanted to mention that before I got into the rest of the video, because it'll help sort of have you make a connection between those things, because that is the closest thing in human form to being a representation of yin and yang. So think of our ideas of womanhood and our ideas of manhood as essentially being a reflection of yang or a reflection of yin. All right, so the first dichotomy that I want to explore is the dichotomy of substance, which is yin, and movement, which is yang. So yin has substance, but doesn't have any ability for change or transformation. It is basically waiting potential. Now, yang, it has movement, but no substance. So it has the ability to transform and to enact itself upon a substance, but it doesn't actually have anything to develop on its own. It has to find a yin element. You could also think of this in terms of the dichotomy of being versus doing. And so if you think about yourself as a system, so think about your entire being as a system. So you cannot do things without first existing, and you also cannot exist without doing things. There has to be some kind of movement going on there. And this is why these two polar energies are always needed to be intertwined with one another as one thing, because no system can be a system without both existence and movement. Now, if we look at the elements of water and earth and fire and air, we can divide those into yin and yang as well, which goes along with the idea of substance and movement. So the yin elements would be earth and water. So essentially, those are the substance. They have the most substance out of the four. But fire and air can create transformation in those substances and chemical reactions within those substances. So for example, earth is just earth, but if it is hit by fire, there's going to be some kind of change or transformation or destruction. Or if something is hit by air, then there can be growth from that, and there can also be oxidation from that. So you want to think about that in terms of you have something that exists, and then there is an energy that gets enacted upon it. And again, back to our ocean example, we have our ocean just as pure existence, so that is yin, and then you have the movement element, the wave nature of it, where you have movement and transformation within that system. Another example of substance and movement relative to yin and yang would be in the creation of a child. So, for example, the sperm, they have movement, they have direction, they have a goal, and they have a transformative power. They don't have much substance on their own. They're much, much smaller than the egg. But they have the ability to engender change in the egg. And so essentially, the egg is the waiting, is the thing that has the more substance. And the sperm is what makes its way to the egg, and in combination they can create a brand new system. Also, the sperm is very, very short-lived, so even though it has more movement than the egg stays around much longer. So this also relates to that metaphor of being versus doing. Now, what I find to be quite amusing and interesting is we can look at different fairy tales, and we can see the same kind of theme as we can see with the conception of a child relative to sperm and egg, and a similar kind of reflection of yin and yang. So if you think about, okay, you have sperm and egg, you have the sperm that can engender change, and then you have the egg, which is basically the being, the untapped potential going on there. Now, if we look at the archetypal myth of, let's say, the lady in waiting. You have a princess up in a tower. She can't go anywhere. She can't do anything. She's basically stuck sitting there, just waiting. And then you have, let's say, a knight coming to free her. Maybe he goes through a lot of perils. Maybe he competes with other knights for her heart. And essentially, he goes there, and if she accepts him, then he can engender change. He can kind of set that potential free from its prison. So she is a representation of untapped potential that can have change engendered by it by the yang. So this is a really good example of yin and yang. And so if we take our sperm and egg example, we can see how that knight sort of represents the sperm. The sperm, they have to compete with other sperm. They have to go and they have to find their lady in waiting in the form of the egg, the untapped potential. And then if the lady in waiting, the egg, accepts them, then change can be engendered and a whole entire new system can be born in the form of a new child. All right, so the second dichotomy that I want to cover relative to yin and yang is the distinction between the general power source, which is yin, versus the specific expression of that power source, which is yang. Again, if you notice, these two things are not separate, but they are different aspects of the same thing. So again, with our ocean example, we have the general power source having all of the potential energy, which is the ocean. And then you have the kinetic energy, the wave nature, which is each individual wave. So general power source would be ocean, and specific expressions thereof would be each wave. So this particular type of relationship between yin and yang is exemplified by the Hindu goddess Durga. So basically, as a goddess, she is female, and thus she is yin. So goddesses are normally a representation of yin. Sometimes there can be exceptions, but usually. However, she has many arms, and in each one of the hands on those arms is basically an aspect of a male god. And in fact, the arms themselves come from one of the male gods within Hinduism. And so basically, Durga is a representation of being the yin, which is the general power source, and each arm of hers represents the yang, the masculine, each specific expression that comes off of that power source. Durga is also androgynous, so she shows also that yin and yang ebb and flow together. So again, it's the idea that yin and yang are never really separate, they just have sort of different aspects coming into play. Another reflection of this dichotomy would be the earth. So you have the earth, which is the general power source for all things, and then you have each creation that comes off of the earth. So each tree, each human being, each animal, everything that comes from the earth would be a yang expression of earth as a yin entity. And so relative to humanity, we could think of human beings as being a yang expression that comes off of the yin earth. But there's also another way we can look at this. So if we have like yin as Mother Nature, yin as the earth, essentially all human ideas and all human technologies placed on top of the earth, that essentially take the earth and transform it into something else, something specific that we can use, like a society would be an invention, or any kind of ideology or technology that human beings come up with. That would be basically engendering a change in what is. So we have nature, and then we have humanity creating specific expressions of that nature. So we are yang, also engendering yang. But at the same time, there's no separation between ourselves and the earth. The earth is kind of our mother. It is what we're born from, it's what we'll die into, and we're not separate from that either. So again, it's this theme of the yin and yang never being separate. Now, one thing I wanted to mention relative to this example would be that currently as a society, we are sort of imbalanced with the earth. We've become too powerful to be as yang as we are. And so there's a lot of dangers in being too yang in relation to the earth. So I'm going to talk in the future about, yang imbalance and what we can do to reintegrate yin a bit more, and what I think will essentially lead to being able to live more in harmony with nature, and to kind of even out the imbalances that exist between yin and yang. All right, so the next dichotomy that I want to go over is the material yin and the ideological yang. So basically matter and mind. All right, so as I said before, Mother Nature is basically an expression of yin. So all things in the material realm are also an expression of yin primarily. And this is specifically why nature is referred to as Mother Nature, and why when you hear people talk about natural phenomena and personifying it, they always personify it as a woman. They're like, oh, there she blows, you know, talking about a tornado or a hurricane or some other natural occurrence like that. And what's really interesting is that our language reflects it. So the word matter and the word mother have the same etymological roots. And I didn't realize this until one day I was talking to my husband, and he told me, I asked him what the Hungarian word for matter was. So he's Hungarian, that's why I asked him. But basically, you know, my husband, he calls me like a lot of different things, and a lot of the names have something generally to do with mama. And, you know, we call each other mama and daddy because we have kids together and everything. And so basically, he calls me often Anya, which is the Hungarian word for mother. And so one day I was asking him, like, what is the word for matter? And he told me that the Hungarian word for matter was anyag. And I noticed that there was a similarity there. And I was like, and I had already, you know, kind of known about the archetypal and, you know, sort of esoteric links between Mother Nature and the feminine principle and yin and all of that. So I already had that as sort of foreknowledge. So I was like, oh, you have Anya and you have Anyag, do those root from the same word? And he said, yes. You know, and then I thought about, you know, the English word matter, you know, and it's very, very similar to mother. And so a lot of the different languages that kind of root off of Latin also, you know, have a similar relationship between motherhood and matter. So the material, the maternal, very similar words. Language is another thing that tend to have a lot of reflections of yin and yang. For example, like in sign language, which I don't think is that old of a language, but I'm not really sure when it originates. I didn't look it up. But basically, you know, you have your signs, like you have mother signed here and you have father signed here. And that's specifically because, esoterically speaking, the feminine is lower to the ground because it is having to do with the earth, you know, worldliness, the material realm. Whereas the masculine has to do with the ideal, the ideological, the spiritual, you know, things that, you know, we can't grasp, things that are not concrete, things that don't have that substance on their own, but can engender change in basic existence. So you'll find these kind of reflections of yin and yang in language if you look for it, if you know what you're looking for. So basically, yang is ideological and purely of the mind. So it has the ability to engender change in things, but it doesn't really have substance on its own. You can't hold on to an ideology, but you could certainly say that an ideology would have an effect on something. In a sense, an ideology sort of functions as a technology of sort that causes change in the world. Also, relative to the material and the ideological, there tends to be a common theme in representation of great father and great mother gods, where the great father gods are usually sky gods and the great mother gods are usually earth goddesses. And so the sky god is usually a lofty figure, you know, kind of expects a lot, is very idealistic, very perfectionistic. And again, there's a sense of distance there, and a sense of loftiness, and a sense of non-tangibility. Again, the no substance coming back, you know, can't really be grasped. But it is something that engenders change in people, gives somebody something to aspire to. Whereas the great mother goddesses tend to be earth goddesses, mostly because the earth is what we notice gives us life and gives us the things that we need. And so basically it has to do with seeing the spirituality in nature and around us, and, you know, really existing on this planet and just thinking of the planet as magical in and of itself. And so this is also a reflection of those elements that I brought up earlier. So sky gods, you know, what's in the sky but air and sun? So that is air and fire. What is on earth but earth and water, you know, which are the yin, the feminine elements. All right, so as I had mentioned before, one of the main dichotomies that I wanted to discuss is the dichotomy of the feminine yin and the masculine yang. And so if you've noticed of all the dichotomies that I've gone over so far and all of the archetypal symbols that I've mentioned, you'll notice a recurring theme that the feminine things, the things that are relating most to womanhood and the feminine principle, are the yin things, and the things relating to manhood and the masculine principle are the yang things. And this can kind of give us some good hints about how these energies sort of express themselves. So basically, the reason why men and women and masculinity and femininity are used so often as an expression of these two polar energies is because that's really the closest thing in human form that we have as a reflection of yin and yang. So if you take women as a whole group and you take men as a whole group, women are going to be more yin and men are going to be more yang. Now, each individual person is different, so you could pick a random person out of that group. Most likely, if it's a man, they're going to be more yang and a little less yin. They're going to have both, but you could also totally pick someone out of that group that is completely the opposite. You could pick out a man who's more yin and a woman who is more yang. Basically, any combination of yin and yang is an acceptable combination. You just have to have both. So basically, to create a living system, you have to have both, but it doesn't matter what the ratio of the two would be. Also, in knowing about the connection between yin and femininity and yang and masculinity, basically it kind of gives you a lot of great hints when it comes to reading anything that was written in esoteric language, because a lot of the myths and the stories that were written in esoteric language, the gender of the character can give you hints as to what the ideas mean. And you can also make connection to other symbols that I had mentioned earlier in the video as well. And also, if there are characters or images that are a combination of the masculine and feminine, like this is an example of the integration and the inseparability of yin and yang. So, for example, if you look at the Greek goddess Hermaphrodite, which is a mix between Hermes and Aphrodite, basically this is the feminine and the masculine in conjunction with one another. So if again you think about the masculine being the specific and the feminine being the general power source, this is kind of how that combination works. So if you think about Aphrodite, who is the Greek goddess of beauty, and basically she's also a representation of the divine feminine in general, and that has to do with the kind of formless wisdom, the wisdom that the human mind can't really pick up on per se. It's basically subconscious. Could be a stand-in for the subconscious, which is also feminine and yin. Now, if we have Hermes there, however, Hermes is the messenger god. And basically, as the messenger god, is responsible for communication and language, these types of things. So basically, when you have an integration between Hermes and Aphrodite, and between the masculine and feminine, the yang element, the masculine element, the Hermes aspect, can actually go into that formless wisdom and can bring it forth out into reality in a comprehensible way that the human mind can understand and that the human mouth can communicate it to you. So basically, this is the idea behind the integration between the anima and animus that Jung spoke about. And I have another video on that too if you want to check that out. Basically, you have to have the masculine and the feminine elements integrated within yourself in order to have access to wisdom. Because let's say, for example, you're a more feminine-oriented person naturally. Well, you're going to be kind of in that space of wisdom, but you're not really going to be able to understand what it's telling you. You might get like intuitions and urges and emotions, but all of that will be kind of floating out in the ether. Like you'll feel it, but you won't be able to communicate it. And you need the masculine element within yourself to be integrated in order to bring it forth so that people can understand it. And also so you can understand it. Now let's say that you're a more masculine or yang-oriented kind of person. Well, you're going to have the ability to communicate and to be able to codify something, but you won't really have anything to codify. Again, if yang has no substance on its own, so it requires the yin to take the substance and to form it into something. So think of the yin as like a lump of clay, and the yang as being the thing that shapes the lump of clay into something. So basically that combination between Hermes and Aphrodite is all about having the masculine and feminine elements integrated within oneself in order to be able to have access to wisdom. So the wisdom is the feminine, and the communication, the insight aspect of it, is the masculine. Now, one thing that you really want to watch out for in knowing that yin is feminine and yang is masculine is to not try to push yourself toward one pole or another. Basically, whatever you have within you is what you have. So you have a particular yin and yang ratio, and that's your preconditioned personality. And so, a man who wants to make himself more attractive might be tempted to try to push himself more toward yang, or a woman who wants to make herself more attractive might want to push herself more toward yin, because they're seeing those two poles, and polarity does create attraction. But at the same time, you don't want that attraction to happen outside of yourself without it first happening within yourself. Because in order to be a whole person, you have to have both elements integrated. So don't fall into that trap of trying to minimize one and sort of overextend the other. The main thing is to be a fully integrated whole human being, which is going to have both yin and yang. And again, when you don't have both of those being able to fully play themselves out, that's when you get a lot of dysfunction and a lot of problems with consciousness, and you won't really have access to wisdom, like I had just mentioned. Another thing to be aware of is that if you look back at gender roles of the past, a lot of those tend to be taken as like a fundamentalist understanding of esoteric ideas of the masculine and feminine. So again, I had mentioned earlier that, they basically have like the lady in waiting that has no movement of her own, but is waiting for the man to come along who has movement, who has goals and things like that. Old-time gender roles took that as quite dogmatic, as in women should be and not do, and men should do and not really focus too much on the existence aspect of it. Kind of be willing to blip out of existence whenever necessary. So this is where a lot of the pitfalls can come in relative to knowing yin and yang have a relationship to the masculine and feminine, is because if we're highly identified with our gender, as many people are, their gender is important to them. My gender is important to me as well. I'm not judging that as bad. But if your gender is something that's really, really important to you, you want to really watch out, because conceptually you could start falling in love with one over the other, and you could neglect to realize what's actually there. And basically what's there you can bring forth, you can reintegrate, and you can exalt that to its highest level, which is going to be a lot healthier. So some other metaphors that can be seen relative to the masculine and feminine and yin and yang would be actually in the form of the male and female genitalia themselves. So if we look at the female genitalia, basically everything is internal in there. And in the masculine, the male genitalia, basically everything is external. And we can notice even in the act of intercourse how that sort of like that hermaphrodite kind of interplay between the masculine and feminine kind of comes into play, because it is the Hermes that has to sort of go into the subconscious and to bring insight forth from there. Likewise, a child comes forth from the intercourse between two human beings. Also, again, with our sperm and egg example, we have the masculine sperm and we have the feminine egg, and again, that feminine egg is the power source. It has more substance than the sperm, but it has no movement or transformation on its own. It's only when the sperm comes that the movement gets engendered. And through the combination of those two things, you get a whole entire new system. So that is how the masculine and feminine, when they come together, they create something completely new. And again, what I find really, really interesting is that, you know, ancient people sort of intuitively knew this. Like, now they wouldn't be able to say, oh, sperm and egg and this happens. But again, you can see a lot of the same themes happening relative to a lot of literature, you know, myths, anything with esoteric languages. So it's very, very interesting how, you know, sometimes that holistic thinking can precede science, and science can come through and it can show the same reflection that those myths once showed. All right, the next dichotomy, and the last one I'll go over in this video today, is a dichotomy of embodiment, which is yin, and transcendence, which is yang. So this one I think is especially important for anybody who's on the spiritual path, anybody who's seeking enlightenment or ego transcendence. So oftentimes when people are seeking enlightenment, they're looking simply to transcend, which is the yang element of the path. But what I experienced when I had my experiences of ego transcendence, it was just as much about embodiment, being fully present here as a human being. So if you think about enlightenment from the perspective of merely trying to transcend the ego, it's like, well, you know, if our eternal aspect is the yang aspect of ourselves, is the thing, you know, we transcend our identity, you know, and we end up in this space. Well, it's like it doesn't really make sense, because we have the entirety of eternity to be that, and yet we have just this very small sliver of time to exist as this individual human being and to be embodied as this person and to experience the experiences of life. And what I find often is that a lot of seekers on the path tend to think that transcendence all there is, and they want to just detach from everything that's here, and they kind of think of life as something that is to be transcended. And this is being too focused on the masculine element of the path. Now ultimately, you know, you don't want to get too much into the weeds of ideas relative to the path in the first place, but understanding this can maybe help you get rid of some resistances to being a person that exists here in reality, while also realizing that this dualistic illusion is an illusion, but it's also an important illusion at the same time. So relative to my experiences of ego transcendence, and specifically the first one, which was far more about the physical element and was really an experience of the divine feminine as much as it was an experience of ego transcendence. You know, so what I felt, well, hang on, let me go back actually before that experience. So from age, let's say 16 to age 20, which when I had that first experience, I was 20. So in those years, I had become very, very ideological. And I had been basically living up in my head. And I'd always had a tendency to do this because the cerebral was always comforting to me, because it was predictable and it's something that I kind of could navigate my way around with better. And it also gave me a way to sort of confirm my own worth to myself. So it was always up in my head. And I always had a discomfort with the body ever since I really learned of the concept of death from a young age. So I was always very terrified of that. And as I got older and older, you know, and got into my teenage years, this kind of got worse and worse. And especially between the ages of 16 and 20, I got to the point where reality seemed very thin to me. Like I had become very dissociated from my body. And, you know, basically, you know, my body was a stressful place to be. Because I was so uncomfortable with the idea that my body would one day die, and I felt like my body was against me. Like one day my body would be the thing that annihilates me because it's temporary. And, you know, I even had like this panic attack one time where I was like, oh my God, I'm just a robot. That's all I am. I'm a robot. Like, it was all I could say, because I just had this very negative feeling about having a body. And a lot of these this I can see is echoed in a lot of anti-yin sentiments around society, you know, where they look down upon the body and they prefer things like the mind and they think that's superior. And so I had kind of embodied that where, you know, basically I was so much in my mind and so much not in my body. And again, reality felt very, very thin to me. It was like a soap bubble that could pop at any moment. I literally felt that disassociated from reality. And as I would walk along, I remember thinking this when I was a freshman in college. I would walk around campus and I would barely feel like my feet were even touching the ground, and not like in a positive, like, oh, a joyful, lighthearted way, but literally I felt like just nothing was really happening, like I really wasn't there, and it was terrifying to me. And so when I had my first experience of ego transcendence, what I felt was more of a connection to the body. There was this deep grounding in reality that happened, as much as it was a transcendence as well. So it was kind of in the sense of like, imagine that I was this log, right? Like I was just the trunk part of the tree. You know, I had some branches going up into the sky, let's say, and then I just had my trunk, but I wasn't rooted in anything. So when I had that experience of ego transcendence that first time, it was as though I was that log, but I had suddenly grown roots that went way, way, way deep into the earth. And because those roots went way deep into the earth, the branches reached further and further into the heavens. And so there was this connection between body and spirit. So basically, I felt more embodied than I ever had, but in a sense there was this sense of detachment. Like I recognized that I was going to die one day, and I recognized that I was going to be forgotten, but I suddenly saw that as so beautiful, like a beautiful aspect of existing here in this temporary form. And, you know, essentially just like a flower wilting one day or leaves falling off of a tree, you know, like that, I was a part of nature that way. And so there was this sense of a deep connection to physicality while also a transcendence aspect where I could see that all of reality in its mundanity was completely spiritual, because the mundane was pregnant with spiritual energy in a sense. And again, there was no separation between the two. It's just I could notice those two different aspects ebbing and flowing with one another, and there was nothing that wasn't spiritual about it. You know, so I think it's very, very important for somebody on the path to not demonize or to ignore the importance of living this life. So if you think about the tree metaphor that I just mentioned, that's another example, just like Hermaphrodite and just like Durga, of that combination between the yin and the yang. And basically the idea is that the power source is the earth, and the expression thereof are those branches that stretch out into the heavens. And so that tree that I just mentioned would be how you would want to be on the spiritual path. You would want to not have a resistance to having your roots set down really well and grounded into reality, while also stretching your branches as high up as you can. And the main idea is to not just transcend this life and to exist as that eternal aspect of yourself. Again, you have eternity to do that. The special thing about it would be to actually live embodied as a human being, while also having transcended the ego and being able to feel the connection to the divine while living this life. So that tree, like Durga, like Hermaphrodite, like Shiva, Shakti, like all of these archetypal images of yin and yang, basically it shows the importance of having that connection and that integration between those two polar subtle energies. So my advice to you is to allow yourself to be androgynous like the tree. So because every living and non-living system has yin and yang, including yourself, and really, honestly, if we look at ourselves, we're not just one system, we're many systems working together within a much bigger system. So it's very important that we learn not to resist yin and not to resist yang. Now this can be difficult because yin especially can be either demonized or just people are just not fully aware of it yet. So it's very, very important to make sure that you are able to reintegrate. Now, if you are allowing of both of these energies to play out in whichever way they want to without ideas and traumas and complexes getting in the way, essentially they will do the work themselves. They want to integrate. It's most natural for them to be integrated. And in fact, the only reason why they wouldn't be integrated is if you've repressed in some way. Because again, every living and non-living system has those two energies ebbing and flowing within them. And if you're looking to reach your highest potential, it does well to know that in alchemy there is this idea of the sacred child. And so basically, that is when the archetypal feminine and the archetypal masculine come together in intercourse with one another to create something new. And so in allowing yin and yang to come together within your own being and to be in intercourse with one another, they will rebirth you again and again and again in ever more exalted forms. So this idea happens a lot in alchemy. So basically the idea of exaltation would be like turning water into wine, to take something lowly and of the earth and to exalt it to its highest. So that is kind of the idea that you want to get at with regard to the integration of yin and yang within yourself. Also, the bridging of opposites in general between yin and yang can create this same type of rebirth within ourselves. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give a full list of yin and yang qualities that I'll post up on the screen as I read. Alright, so on the list I have the yin element listed first and the yang element listed secondary, because remember I had mentioned earlier that yin is always primary and yang is always secondary, so I'm writing it in the same way. So again, the first one, we have primary and secondary. Then we have particle and wave. We have cycles and constants, basically meaning that something that changes and goes through cycles would be the yin, and something that remains the same would be the yang. We have destruction and creation. We have descent and ascension. We have the temporal and the infinite. Unconscious and conscious. Internal and external. Mysterious and clear. Form and formless. Mundane and spiritual. Mother Nature and Father Time. Earth Goddess and Sky God. Earthly and heavenly. Organic and man-made. Whole and parts. Big picture and details. Woman and man. Reality and conceptual frameworks that get laid over reality. Real and ideal. Wholeness and perfection. The body and the mind. Emotions and the intellect. Animal instinct and civilized behavior. Concrete and abstract. Darkness and light. Night and day. Moon and sun. Ecology and economy. Adaptation to nature and manipulation of nature. Contraction and expansion. Chaos and order. Creativity and productivity. Wisdom and knowledge or insight. Intuition and logic. Collectivity and individuality. So if we can bridge these opposites and reintegrate them and allow for yin and yang to play out with this in us whichever way that it wants to, basically we'll be able to embody the spirit of Hermaphrodite or the ocean or the tree, where we can have that access to wisdom, and we can also have it become comprehensible to our minds so that we can codify that wisdom into insights. Now, yin and yang naturally mix, and so the only thing that keeps them from doing so is if you have resistances and traumas and all kinds of repressions. These types of things get in the way from yin and yang coming together. So, or even limiting beliefs can do that. Like if you think that a certain thing maybe isn't acceptable to feel or something like that. So, in order to be able to have yin and yang ebb and flow together, it's not really something that you have to will to happen. Basically, you just have to get rid of the obstacles first to them actually coming together and integrating. So I recommend doing some inner work practices like shadow work or like meditation to get rid of some of those obstacles so that the yin and yang may flow more freely within you and, can be actually integrated. Alright, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the subscribe button below and leave me a comment down below. Also, I wanted to say thank you to my patrons. I really appreciate it. And that's all I have for you for now. And until next time, keep becoming more you.